The sky over Seoul didn't just leak. It bled a cold, relentless gray that turned the asphalt into a dark mirror. Inside the cabin of his black sedan, Kang Jun-Seo sat encased in a silence so thick it felt pressurized. The only sound was the rhythmic, expensive tick of his watch and the distant, frantic argument of his board of directors pouring through the hands-free system. They were talking about stock margins and tax havens, the trivialities of the silk world. Jun-Seo stared ahead, his predatory calm undisturbed, until the headlights caught a flash of impossible white in the gloom. It happened in less than 5 seconds. A blur of silk nightgown, a pale, terrified face. Then the sickening, heavy thud that vibrated through the chassis and into his very bones. The windshield spiderwebbed, a jagged map of a broken future. Jun-Seo slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt as the board's voices continued to drone, unaware that their empire had just struck a goddess. He stepped out into the rain, the water immediately plastering his slicked back hair to his forehead. There, lying like a broken doll against the curb, was Minnie's. Her skin was porcelain, her long, dark hair fanned out in the oil-slicked puddles. She looked fragile, a stark, innocent contrast to the brutal machinery that had just crushed her. Jun-Seo knelt, his luxury watch catching the dim light as he checked her pulse. It was faint, a fluttering bird trapped under ice. In that moment, the Unbreakable CEO faced the ultimate psychological crossroads. He looked at his dashcam, then at the girl. If he stayed, the headlines would read, "Tech Giant Arrested." The stock would plummet. The silk would tear. If he left, she was just another Jane Doe on a rainy Tuesday. The weight of his hidden empire pressed down on him. Power, he had always believed, was the ability to walk away from a mistake without looking back. With a face like granite, he scooped her up, not to save her, but to hide the evidence. He drove to the nearest ER, shouting for a doctor, but as soon as the gurney disappeared behind the swinging doors, the CEO became a ghost. He dropped her phone on the floor, turned his shadowed face from the CCTV, and walked out into the night. He didn't know that the blood on his hands belonged to the butcher's daughter. He didn't know that Victor Caldero was already waking up to a world without his anchor. Jun-Seo had chosen the shadows to protect his crown, never realizing he had just invited the iron to come and take it. In the heights of the Gangnam district, Kang Jun-Seo lived within a fortress of glass and steel. His office was a cathedral of the silk, a sterile high-altitude vacuum where the air felt scrubbed of all human scent. The lighting was a sharp, clinical blue that reflected off the polished marble floors and the cold surface of his obsidian desk. There were no family photos, no scattered papers, only the low hum of servers and the panoramic view of a city that looked like a motherboard beneath his feet. Jun-Seo sat center frame, his tailored suit jacket draped perfectly over his lean frame, his dark eyes fixed on a monitor as he moved millions with a flick of his finger. Here, power was clean. It was mathematical. It was a world where emotion was a bug in the system, and Jun-Seo was the ultimate firewall. But 5 miles away, across the river, power smelled like old leather, expensive tobacco, and stale blood. This was the iron world of Victor Caldero. The butcher's den was a subterranean sanctuary buried beneath the foundations of a derelict warehouse. There were no windows here, only the suffocating weight of the earth above. The room was bathed in a thick, amber-lit gloom, the shadows so heavy they felt tactile. Victor sat behind a heavy oak desk scarred by decades of deals made in the dark. While Jun-Seo's world was built on digital projections, Victor's was built on physical presence. He didn't use a computer. He used his eyes, which rarely blinked, and his hands, which stayed folded with a terrifying, predator-like stillness. The only sound in the room was the low crackle of a dying fireplace and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be feared. The contrast was a masterclass in the psychology of the elite versus the primal. Jun-Seo was the scalpel, precise, elegant, and detached. Victor was the hammer, blunt, ancient, and immovable. In his glass tower, Jun-Seo believed he was the master of his own fate because he could control the data. But in the amber shadows of the butcher's den, Victor understood a truth the CEO had forgotten, that at the end of every digital trail, there is a human body. As Victor reached out to touch a small framed photo of Minna, the only light in his dark world, the iron and the silk were already on a collision course. Jun-Seo was busy polishing his crown in the blue blue light of his office, unaware that the butcher was already putting on his leather gloves, ready to reach up and pull that glass tower down into the dirt. The rain didn't fall so much as it hammered, a relentless assault that turned the neon lights of Seoul into bleeding vertical streaks against the black sky. Inside the cockpit of his luxury sedan, Kang Jun-Seo was the picture of the Silk, composed, insulated, and entirely detached from the chaos outside. He was deep into a heated negotiation on the hands-free line, his voice a low, steady baritone that never betrayed the high-stakes tension of the merger. His left hand rested lightly on the wheel, the sleeve of his tailored suit shifting just enough to reveal the face of his Rolex. The sapphire crystal caught the blue light of the dashboard, ticking away the seconds of his dominance. Then the world shattered. Pale flicker of white darted into the glare of his high beams. Not a stray animal, but a person. A girl. In the split second before impact, Jun-Seo saw her face through the rain-slicked windshield. It was a face from another realm. Wide, expressive eyes filled with a paralyzing terror, long, dark hair plastered to her cheeks, and a white silk nightgown that made her look like a ghost lost in the storm. There was no time to think, only the violent, sickening crunch of metal meeting bone. The windshield spiderwebbed instantly, a jagged fracture blooming right over his field of vision. The car skidded to a halt, the silence that followed more deafening than the crash. Jun-Seo sat for a heartbeat, his breath hitching. He stepped out into the freezing downpour, his leather shoes sinking into the rising puddles. There, lying in the gutter like a discarded lily, was Minna. The innocent had been broken by the elite. He knelt beside her, his Rolex catching on the fabric of his sleeve. The impact had been so great, the watch face was cracked, a spiderweb of glass mirroring the windshield. He felt for a pulse. It was there, thready, desperate, a fragile rhythm fighting against the dark. In that moment, the psychology of the CEO took over. To stay was to invite the police, the tabloids, and the inevitable collapse of his tech empire. To stay was to let the world see the blood on the Silk. He scooped her up, his movements robotic and efficient, and placed her in the back seat. He drove with a cold, predatory focus to the nearest emergency room, pulling into the ambulance bay. He carried her in, shouting for help, but as the nurses swarmed the gurney, Jun-Seo looked at the CCTV camera humming in the corner. He saw his reflection, a man of power covered in the stains of his own mistake. He didn't wait for a name. He didn't sign a form. He dropped her phone on the linoleum floor, turned his shadowed face away from the lens, and vanished back into the rain. He left Jane Doe number 402 behind, believing he had bought his freedom. He didn't know he had just signed a contract with the butcher. The ICU was a cathedral of artificial life, a space where the air was sterile and the silence was punctuated only by the rhythmic mechanical sigh of ventilators. Minna lay at the center of it all, a fragile figure swaddled in white, her skin nearly the same shade as the bleached sheets. Above her, the monitors pulsed with a steady, clinical green glow, tracing the jagged mountain range of a heart that refused to stop beating. She was no longer a daughter or a person to the hospital staff. She was simply Jane Doe number 402, a ghost delivered by a stranger who had vanished before the paperwork could be signed. Across the city, the amber-lit shadows of the butcher's den were no longer peaceful. They were suffocating. Victor Caldero stood by the fireplace, his broad shoulders casting a mountain-like silhouette against the wall. He had called her phone 10 times. 10 times he had heard the hollow digital ring that signified a connection to a void. The iron in him didn't panic. It solidified. His heavy-lidded eyes, which usually moved with the slow deliberation of a predator, were fixed on the empty chair where she usually sat. The silence in the mansion was no longer the silence of luxury. It was the silence of an occupied grave. When the call finally came from his head of security, Victor didn't flinch. He listened to the report that her phone had been traced to a public hospital found on a cold linoleum floor near the ER entrance. Victor's face remained a mask of terrifying calm, a stillness so profound it felt like the eye of a hurricane. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't smash the glass in his hand. He simply folded his hands together, his leather gloves creaking in the quiet room. The search began not with sirens, but with a whisper that rippled through the city's underworld. Within 30 minutes, a fleet of black SUVs descended upon the hospital, their engines humming like a low-frequency threat. Victor walked through the sliding doors of the ICU, his presence so heavy it seemed to dim the fluorescent lights. He stood over bed number 402, his massive frame looming over the monitors. He looked at the bruises on her face, the bandages on her head, and the way her long hair had been tucked away by a stranger's hand. He reached out, his simple rings glinting under the hospital lights, and touched the metal rail of her bed. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He simply looked at the monitor's blinking light and committed its rhythm to memory. The butcher had found his anchor, but the man who had cast it adrift was still out there, hiding in a tower of glass. Victor leaned down and whispered a promise into the sterile air, a promise that the iron was coming to collect its debt, and that the city would burn until the man in the blue light was found. In the blue-lit silence of his private terminal, Kang Jun-Seo sat like a ghost at a feast. The glow of the triple monitor setup reflected in his dark, unblinking eyes as he accessed the server for his personal vehicle. The footage was there, a high-definition nightmare trapped in a file folder. He watched the thumbnail for a split second, a flash of white silk, the violent jolt of the frame, and then the dark, empty road. With a face like carved marble, his fingers hovered over the keyboard. He wasn't just deleting a file, he was scrubbing a soul from his conscience. Lines of encrypted code began to scroll rapidly across the screen, a digital waterfall of erasure that sought to overwrite the truth with a string of zeros. Behind him, the glass door to the inner sanctum slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Han Ji-yeon stepped in, her professional composure as sharp as the bob of her jet-black hair. She held a tablet to her chest, her observant eyes immediately locking onto the reflection in the glass partition. She saw the scrolling code. She saw the frantic green delete in progress bar. Most of all, she saw the tension in Jun-Seo's shoulders, the rare fracture in his silk armor. "The board is waiting for the quarterly projection, sir," she said, her voice steady but laced with a subtle, unspoken weight. Jun-Seo didn't turn around. He tapped a final key, and the screen went black. "Tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. I was just cleaning up some redundant logs." Ji-yeon didn't move. She noticed the way his luxury watch caught the light. The sapphire crystal was jagged, a silver-gray crack splitting the face in two. She looked from the broken watch to the obsidian surface of his desk, where a single, stray thread of white silk lay snagged on the corner of his laptop. She had been with him for 7 years. She knew the smell of his success and the scent of his fear. This wasn't a routine maintenance check. This was a burial. As Jun-Seo stood up and adjusted his jacket, his expression returning to its predatory calm, Ji-yeon stepped aside to let him pass. She watched him walk toward the elevator, his silhouette tall and lean against the panoramic view of the city. The digital trail was gone from the server, but it was etched into the air between them. In the quiet of the office, she looked back at the terminal. She knew that in Jun-Seo's world, a deleted file was a victory, but in her world, a missing piece of data was a beacon. The silk was trying to smooth over the wrinkles of a crime, but as she felt the unspoken fear tightening in her chest, Ji-yeon realized that some ghosts can't be deleted. They just wait in the cache. The boxing gym was a cavern of sweat and muffled violence, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of heavy bags sounding like a slow, beating heart in the gloom. Victor Caldero stood in the center of the ring. Though he wasn't there to fight, he was there to think. The air was thick, smelling of old leather and iron, illuminated only by a few low-hanging industrial lamps that fought a losing battle against the shadows. Victor pulled a pair of black leather gloves onto his massive hands, the material creaking with a sound like a closing casket. He didn't tighten them for sport. He tightened them for the work that was coming. On a small wooden stool beside the ropes lay a tiny evidence bag. Inside was a single jagged chip of automotive paint, a deep metallic obsidian flecked with the kind of microscopic diamond dust found only on cars that cost more than a neighborhood. His men had recovered it from the scene, a needle found in the rain-slicked haystack of the Seoul gutters. Victor picked up the bag, his heavy-lidded eyes narrowing as he held it up to the dim light. The realization hit him with a cold, focused clarity. This wasn't the work of a local street thug or a panicked drunk. This was the Silk. This was the elite, someone from the glass towers who looked down at the world and saw nothing but ants. someone who had looked at his Minnie, his innocent anchor in a sea of blood, and decided that their schedule or their reputation was worth more than her life. The butcher's face remained a mask of terrifying stillness, but his hands, clad in that dark leather, slowly balled into fists. To Victor, the world was a balance sheet of blood and debt. If a man from the heights thought he could reach down and break something precious without paying the price, he was mistaken. The iron didn't care about stock prices or corporate legacies. Victor looked around the dark gym, the silhouettes of his men standing like statues in the corners, waiting for a word. He thought of the blue-lit offices where the driver was likely hiding, sipping expensive scotch and imagining the secret was buried. Victor stepped out of the ring, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He didn't need a name yet. He had the scent. The elite had drawn blood from the butcher's heart, and in the primal logic of Victor's world, that meant the towers had to fall. He adjusted the fit of his gloves one last time, a predatory calm settling over him. The hunt was no longer about a missing girl, it was about an innocent being discarded by a monster, and as he walked out into the night, the amber glow of his cigar was the only warning the city would get that the butcher was coming to collect. The hospital at 3 a.m. was a labyrinth of humming fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic, a place where the living and the dead traded places in the quiet. Kang Jun-Seo moved through the corridors like a shadow, his silk identity buried beneath the anonymity of a dark, oversized hoodie. He walked with his head slightly tilted down, a predatory calm masking the tremor of guilt that had driven him back to this place. He hadn't come to apologize. He had come to settle a line item. In his world, if you pay the bill, the debt is erased. He approached the billing window in the shadows of the ER lobby, his luxury watch hidden beneath a frayed sleeve. With a few swift, silent strokes of a burner card, he cleared the mounting costs for Jane Doe number 402. He didn't look at the clerk. He didn't ask for a status update. He simply turned back toward the ICU wing, compelled by a dark curiosity to see the wreckage he had caused before he vanished for good. At that same moment, the heavy double doors of the ICU wing swung open. Victor Caldero stepped out into the hallway, his massive frame dominating the space. He moved with a slow, tectonic weight, his simple rings glinting under the harsh overhead tubes. His face was a mask of iron, unblinking, terrifyingly still, carrying the heavy-lidded gaze of a man who had spent the last 4 hours watching a ventilator breathe for his heart. The hallway became a tunnel of high-tension silence. As they approached one another, the world seemed to slip into slow motion. Jun-Seo kept his gaze fixed on the linoleum, the hood obscuring the sharp jawline and the calculating eyes that usually commanded boardrooms. He could feel the air pressure change as he drew closer to the broad-shouldered silhouette. Victor, the butcher, walked with his hands folded behind his back, his presence so dense it seemed to warp the blue-tinted light around him. They passed within inches. Jun-Seo felt the sudden primal chill of a predator in his proximity, a weight of authority that made his own elite power feel like a hollow shell. Victor's gaze swept over the hooded figure, seeing only a grieving stranger or a tired relative, never imagining that the man who had shattered his innocent was close enough to touch. There was no confrontation, no recognition, only the rhythmic click-clack of their shoes echoing against the sterile walls. Jun-Seo didn't look back until he reached the sliding glass doors. He felt the cold night air hit his face and realized his breath was shallow. He had paid the bill, but as he looked at the glowing red cross of the hospital sign, he realized the iron he had just walked past was a force that money couldn't satisfy. He had survived the standoff, but the scent of the butcher's rage had finally stained the silk. In the sterile brushed chrome sanctuary of the executive washroom, Evan Rowe stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, meticulously adjusting his tie. He was the picture of corporate invisibility, the average height, the forgettable face, the clean-cut aesthetic that allowed him to blend into the background of Kang Jun-Seo's life for years. He watched his reflection, a thin, rehearsed smile playing on his lips that never reached his eyes. It was the look of a man who had waited a decade to see a Titan trip, and now he was the one holding the tripwire. Evan pulled a burner phone from his interior pocket. The light from the screen cast a pale, sickly glow over his sharp features as he dialed a number that was never meant to be in a CEO's contact list. The line connected with a heavy, expectant silence, the kind of silence only the iron world could produce. "He was there," Evan whispered, his voice barely a breath against the mouthpiece. The hospital, 3 in the morning. Black hoodie, obsidian SUV, plates already scrubbed, but the dashcam server was wiped an hour later. It's him. On the other end of the line, the only response was the low, rhythmic crackle of a cigar being drawn. Evan felt a shiver of primal fear, but his ambition was a stronger narcotic. He knew that if he handed Jun-Seo to the butcher, the Silk Empire would be left without a head, and a mole could finally crawl out of the dirt to claim the throne. "I'm sending you the coordinates for his private safe house in Incheon," Evan continued, his smile widening into something predatory. "He thinks he's invisible behind his firewalls. He doesn't know you have his scent." He ended the call and stared back at the mirror. To the world, Evan was the loyal right hand, the forgettable shadow. But in the dark psychology of betrayal, he was the architect of a catastrophe. He had just turned a hit and run into a declaration of war, whispering the secret that would turn the butcher's grief into a directed laser of violence. As he tucked the phone away and smoothed his lapels, Evan didn't see a traitor in the reflection. He saw a successor. He walked out of the room, leaving the silence of the Silk behind, unaware that when you invite a monster like Victor Caldero to dinner, he rarely stops eating once the host is gone. The rooftop of the Incheon safe house was a desolate island of concrete and rusted vents, suspended in a sea of driving rain. Kang Jun-Seo stood at the edge, the wind whipping his black coat around his lean frame. He didn't look like a man cornered. He looked like a statue carved from the night itself. His dark eyes remained fixed on the horizon until the heavy, metallic clack of a handgun being cocked shattered the rhythm of the storm. "You have a long way to fall, CEO." A voice growled, a low, tectonic rumble that cut through the thunder. Victor Caldero stepped out from behind a massive cooling unit, his broad shoulders blocking out the dim city lights. He moved with a terrifying, immovable weight, his leather gloves glistening with rain. Behind him, the silhouettes of his men formed a semicircle of iron, their eyes cold and hungry. Victor stopped 10 feet away, his heavy-lidded gaze fixed on the man who had discarded his daughter like trash. Jun-Seo didn't flinch. He slowly turned, his face half lit by the red glow of a distant neon sign. Despite the gun pointed at his heart, a predatory calm radiated from him, the chilling restraint of a man who had already accounted for his death. "The paint chip led you here," Jun-Seo said, his voice a smooth, elegant blade. "But the coordinates? Those were a gift." Victor's eyes narrowed, the butcher sensing a shift in the gravity of the room. "You think you can talk your way out of a blood debt?" "I'm not talking about mercy, Victor. I'm talking about the mole." Jun-Seo stepped forward, the rain-slicked concrete reflecting his steady stride. "Evan Rowe didn't just give you my location to help you find justice. He gave it to you so you would kill me, leaving my empire vacant for him to strip. While you were hunting me, he was the one who called Minna that night. He lured her out. He needed a tragedy to break the Silk, and he used your daughter as the catalyst." A deafening silence fell over the rooftop, more piercing than the wind. Victor's stillness became absolute. The realization that his innocent had been a pawn in a corporate coup ignited a different kind of fire in his chest, a rage that transcended the man standing before him. "He's at the warehouse," Jun-Seo continued, his eyes locking onto Victor's with a cold, shared understanding. "He has your son. He's clearing the board." Victor slowly lowered the weapon. The iron and the Silk stood in the downpour, two predators recognizing that they were no longer hunter and prey, but two sides of a betrayed coin. The blood debt wasn't gone, but it had a new address. Without a word, Victor gestured to his men. The unlikely alliance was forged in the freezing rain, a partnership of raw power and calculated intellect. Jun-Seo adjusted his luxury watch, the cracked face a reminder of the night his soul broke, and stepped toward Victor's SUV. The towers wouldn't fall tonight. They were going to hunt the man who thought he could play with monsters. The warehouse at the edge of the harbor was a hollow cathedral of rusted metal and dying light, a place where the Silk had finally come to bleed. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt water and the sharp ozone tang of fear. Evan Rowe stood in the center of the bay, his forgettable face twisted into a mask of desperate arrogance as he held a weapon to the temple of a trembling boy, Minna's younger brother. Evan had planned for a war between Titans, but he hadn't prepared for the two of them to arrive at his door as a unified force of vengeance. The heavy steel doors didn't just open, they were torn from their tracks. Victor Caldero entered like a force of nature, his iron presence crushing the air out of the room. Beside him, Kang Jun-Seo moved with a lethal, fluid precision, his sharp jawline set in a mask of elite fury. Evan's hand shook. "One step closer, and the blood is on you," he screamed, his corporate veneer finally dissolving into a pathetic whine. Jun-Seo didn't wait for a negotiation. He moved with a predatory speed Evan couldn't comprehend, lunging not for the man, but for the child. As Evan pulled the trigger, Jun-Seo twisted, shielding the boy with his own frame. A single sharp crack echoed through the rafters. Jun-Seo winced as the lead tore through his shoulder, but he didn't falter. He slammed Evan into the concrete with the cold restraint of a man disposing of trash, while Victor's men swarmed the room like a shadow. The butcher approached, his heavy boots sounding like the tolling of a bell. He looked at Jun-Seo, who sat on the floor, clutching his arm, his black coat darkening with a fresh, wet stain. He looked at his son, safe and terrified. The silence that followed was the heaviest of their lives. Victor reached down, his leather gloves creaking as he pulled his son to his chest. He then turned his heavy-lidded gaze to Jun-Seo. "You saved the boy," Victor said, his voice a low tectonic rumble. "The iron sees this." "The debt is settled?" Jun-Seo asked, his voice strained but elegant, even in pain. Victor stood tall, his silhouette dominating the warehouse. "For the boy, yes. For Minna, no. The debt is a living thing, Jun-Seo. You saved one, but you broke the other." He lowered his head in that slow, predatory nod. "Go. Live with the weight. If I see your face in the blue light of that tower again, before she wakes, there will be no peace." As the sun began to dip below the Seoul skyline, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and gold, Jun-Seo walked out onto the pier. His arm was tucked into a makeshift sling, his luxury watch still cracked, ticking against his wrist. He looked out over the water, the city's lights beginning to flicker on like a motherboard. He had survived the butcher, but the silk was gone forever. He walked toward the horizon, a man of power who finally understood the cost of a choice, carrying the blood piece as a permanent scar.